Welcome back to the deep dive. We've got, well, quite a pile of sources you've sent over articles, research, your own notes too, and they all seem to be pointing towards this one big idea, 2025.
Right.
It hasn't just been, another busy year for global politics. It really feels different, like a genuine turning point.
Really does. The whole world map seems to be getting redrawn, politically speaking.
Exactly. And that's the theme running through everything here.
Yeah, it's striking how consistent it is. So our goal today, I think, is to dive into this material, cut through the noise a bit, and pull out the key insights. We need to understand what's actually happening and, maybe more importantly, figure out why it matters for, well, for you trying to navigate all this change.
And the sources suggest it's not just one thing driving this, is it? It's a complex mix. You've got these long simmering historical issues, economic anxiety. I mean, the pandemic shadow is still there, plus inflation, this uneven recovery.
Absolutely. And then you layer on top of that the social shifts, migration, changing demographics. It's a lot.
Plus the polarization we see everywhere, amplified by social media. And this crisis of trust. The sources cite global surveys showing trust in institutions like parliaments, courts, even the media is hitting rock bottom.
Historic lows, yeah. It's a potent mix, as you say.
It really is. And one of the experts you included, Dr. Helena Mendez, she put it really well. She said, "We're witnessing a pendulum swing in global politics where voters are searching for alternatives to the status quo, sometimes at the expense of democratic norms."
That quote really hits home, doesn't it? Especially that last part. At the expense of democratic norms.
Yeah, that feels like a thread we're going to see woven through a lot of these country examples.
I think so too. It really resonates with what the sources detail, country by country.
Okay, well, let's grab that thread then and start pulling. The material kicks off with Poland. The sources are calling it a striking return to nationalist rule there.
Yes, the Law and Justice Party, Jarosław Kaczyński is sort of the power behind the throne, and Martin Nowak is the new PM. Their campaign really tapped into concerns about migration, national sovereignty.
And this perception of EU overreach, right?
Exactly. Big time. They combine that with economic populism, a strong dose of cultural conservatism, defending Polish values, resisting EU mandates on things like judicial reforms, refugee quotas, the whole package.
What struck me in the sources was the voter turnout. It was huge.
It was remarkable. 73% turnout, up 5 points. But the real eye-opener, for me anyway, was the youth vote. Nearly 60% of young voters went for nationalist parties.
Wow, 60%. That's significant. It's not just an older generation thing then.
Not at all. It suggests this message has really broad appeal now.
And the immediate fallout. The sources say relations with Brussels went downhill fast.
Predictably, yes. They doubled down on those controversial judicial reforms, toughened up border security, linking it directly to the war in Ukraine.
Which means the EU is pushing back.
Oh, yeah. Threats to withhold structural funds, legal action. It's shaping up to be a really prolonged standoff. And that could, set a precedent for other countries maybe wanting to challenge EU rules, too.
Okay, quite a situation there. Let's jump across the pond now to Mexico. The sources describe the changes there as unprecedented in scale and substance.
I think that's fair.
Yeah.
I mean, holding a national election to pick Supreme Court justices, federal judges, state judges, that's never happened before.
And the justification from the architects Lopez Obrador, the former president, and Claudia Sheinbaum, the current one, was all about tackling corruption, right? Making the judiciary less elite, more responsive.
That was the argument, yes. Eradicate corruption, democratize the system.
Yeah.
And the reforms themselves are pretty sweeping, based on your sources.
Yeah, reducing Supreme Court seats from 11 to 9, shorter terms, no re-election.
And stripping the court's power to universally suspend laws, that's a big one, now needs the two-thirds majority. Plus, this new disciplinary body for judges.
The logistics sound mind-boggling. One election day, June 1st, picking 881 federal judges from over 3,400 candidates. Thousands more state posts later.
It's huge. And candidates were vetted, but couldn't declare party links openly.
Which is where the concerns come in, I guess. The sources mention worries about voter confusion.
Right, and the risk of, unqualified people getting through, or worse, compromised candidates. The potential for organized crime influence is a serious red flag mentioned in the material. Apparently, there were already scandals involving alleged cartel ties.
So you've got these two completely opposing views. Supporters like Sheinbaum saying it's needed for accountability, breaking the elite's grip.
Exactly. More responsive judiciary, they argue. But the critics, they're warning this guts judicial independence. It erodes checks and balances, risks politicizing the courts.
And could actually increase corruption, ironically.
That's the fear. Some scholars in the sources are using pretty strong terms: abusive constitutionalism, using legal means to dismantle checks, or autocratic legalism, basically empowering the ruling party.
And the markets reacted.
Oh, yes. Foreign direct investment dropped 12% in the first quarter of 2025, according to these papers. Businesses are clearly nervous about the rule of law, contract enforcement.
So Mexico's move is definitely setting a precedent, maybe a worrying one, for constitutional democracy, particularly in Latin America.
It raises huge questions, absolutely.
Okay, let's head back to Europe, France. The legislative elections there, the sources call it a seismic shock.
Seismic is the word. President Macron's centrist coalition is one that's been dominant since, 2017? It just crumbled.
And the drivers seem pretty clear from the sources: inflation hitting people hard, those unpopular pension reforms, immigration debates, and then that big corruption scandal involving ministers.
It all fed into this massive public discontent. And the campaign was heated, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Lots of focus on national identity, economic inequality, France's role in the EU.
And who benefited?
Well, the opposition, significantly. Marine Le Pen's far-right national rally did really well in rural and sort of outer suburban areas, playing on immigration and security fears.
While the far left, Mélenchon's France Unbowed, gained in the cities.
That's right, promising big social reforms, taking a much tougher line with the EU.
So the result is messy.
Deeply fragmented parliament, no majority for anyone, which creates huge uncertainty.
And implications beyond France.
Definitely. France's commitment to EU integration is suddenly looking shaky. There are calls to renegotiate things with Brussels, maybe even cut military spending. Markets are spooked, and there are real fears about prolonged instability affecting the EU, NATO, the whole regional stability picture.
Right. Okay, turning to Asia, India. The 2025 general elections are framed here as a decisive turn toward populism and majoritarian politics.
Yes, Modi's BJP consolidated its power, working with regional parties. And majoritarian politics, just to clarify for listeners, essentially means prioritizing the will, or the perceived will, of the majority group, sometimes over minority rights or legal protections.
The campaign playbook sounds familiar. In some ways, Hindu nationalist themes, economic protectionism promises, but also a really savvy social media game.
Very effective. Plus, the government focused hard on national security messaging, anti-corruption drives, and these welfare schemes that are popular in rural areas.
And the opposition?
Just couldn't get it together, according to the sources. Too fragmented, couldn't present a unified challenge. The BJP's base was solid in the north and west, while regional parties held sway elsewhere.
And since the election, the sources highlight some controversial moves: stricter citizenship laws.
Yes, laws that critics say deliberately disadvantage minorities. Also, expanded government surveillance, more restrictions on religious minorities.
Which has led to protests.
Significant protests, yes. And growing concerns about, the erosion of India's secular identity and the rule of law.
And foreign policy is shifting too. More assertive.
Definitely more assertive. Strengthening ties with the U.S., Japan, while taking a harder line on China and Pakistan. Given India's sheer size, its economy, its demographics, where it heads really matters for the whole Indo-Pacific.
Okay, let's move to South Africa now. A truly historic election there in 2025, wasn't it? The end of the ANC's long reign.
Absolutely historic. First time since apartheid ended that the ANC lost its parliamentary majority.
And the reasons cited in the sources seem pretty consistent. Corruption fatigue, economic stagnation, that persistent, deep inequality.
All catching up with them, yes. The Democratic Alliance, the DA, led by John Steenhuisen, actually came out as the largest party. But, and this is key, they didn't get a majority either.
So a coalition government was formed.
A very broad one, and by all accounts, pretty fractious. You've got parties in there ranging from pushing free market liberalization to demanding radical land reform and social justice programs. Very different agendas.
Which sounds like a recipe for challenges.
Immense challenges. The sources point to sky-high unemployment, failures in delivering basic services, ongoing frustration with corruption and crime. It's a tough environment.
And policy gridlock is already setting in.
On the really tough stuff, yes. Land expropriation, energy policy, education. They're struggling to find common ground, and you're seeing more protests, more strikes, reflecting those deep social divides.
But there's another perspective in the sources, right? A more optimistic take.
There is. Some analysts are framing this whole coalition experiment not just as messy, but potentially as a positive step. A chance for democratic renewal, maybe? Breaking that long period of single-party dominance could, they argue, lead to more accountability.
Interesting. A potential silver lining, perhaps.
It's a counterpoint, certainly to some of the more concerning trends elsewhere.
Okay, speaking of instability, the UK, a snap election in 2025, triggered by, well, more Brexit fallout and general political churn.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
The Conservatives were dealing with internal fights, policy U-turns. They rolled the dice hoping for a fresh mandate.
And it didn't quite work out.
Not really.
Yeah.
Labor made significant gains. They really capitalized on public anger over the cost of living, the state of the NHS, immigration, all those hot-button issues.
Resulting in
Hung parliament. No overall majority for anyone, which meant long, difficult talks to try and form some kind of government.
And the sources highlight youth turnout being high.
Yeah, highest since '97, apparently. And overwhelmingly, young people backed progressive, pro-European candidates. That's a notable generational split.
And at the same time, support for independence is surging again in Scotland and Northern Ireland.
Exactly, raising the real possibility of new referendums on breaking away. So the future of the UK itself feels less certain.
So the implications are pretty wide-ranging. Uncertainty about Britain's place in the world, trade talks stalled, plus these intense domestic debates on healthcare, housing, immigration.
Yeah.
It sounds like a country still very much divided.
Deeply divided, yes. Still wrestling with its post-Brexit identity and future direction.
Okay, now for a really different story. Brazil. Your sources paint this election as a historic shift towards environmentalism.
This one really stands out, doesn't it? Completely different direction from many others. The Green Party, led by Ana Silva, actually formed a coalition government with other progressive parties.
And she's the first Green Party president.
First ever, yes. And they've put environmental protection right at the heart of their agenda. Big pledges, halt Amazon deforestation, massive investment in renewable energy.
Are they following through? The sources mention specific policies.
They are. A moratorium on new logging permits, launching big reforestation projects, concrete actions.
And the international reaction.
Very positive. Lots of praise and, crucially, money. About $5 billion in new climate aid came in from the EU and others, according to the material.
So Brazil's trying to position itself as a leader now.
Absolutely. Leading this new green bloc at the UN, pushing for ambitious global climate goals, sustainable development.
Is there resistance domestically?
Oh, for sure. Agribusiness interests aren't happy. Some regional governments are pushing back, worried about the economic impact. But the polling side suggests the public is broadly supportive of this green shift.
So it's really changing Brazil's image and role on the world stage.
Definitely. A fascinating example of a very different kind of political transformation happening in 2025.
Okay, let's move east again. Indonesia. Here, the sources describe the elections as widely seen as a setback for democracy. That sounds concerning.
It is. The background, according to the material, is that President Joko Widodo's government had already pushed through legal changes before the election. Things like restricting opposition parties, limiting press freedom, giving the executive more power.
Sort of stacking the deck?
That's how critics saw it. And the election itself was apparently troubled allegations of voter intimidation, media censorship, arrests of activists and journalists.
What's the government's justification for all this?
The official line is maintaining stability, fighting extremism. But critics, and there are many cited in your sources, see it as a straightforward, dangerous slide towards authoritarianism.
And there are new laws mentioned, giving the president more power.
Sweeping authority, yes.
Yeah.
Power to dissolve parties, censor online content, more executive control over the courts.
How are neighbors and partners reacting?
With alarm, especially within ASEAN. There's a real fear that democratic backsliding in a major player like Indonesia undermines the whole bloc's credibility, regional stability. And foreign investors are getting nervous too, rethinking plans due to the unpredictability, the political risk.
Right, that makes sense. Okay, one last stop on this world tour. Turkey. Here, the story seems to be the opposite of Indonesia. The sources call it the most significant opposition breakthrough in more than 2 decades.
Yeah, this was a big shift. After ruling for so long, President Erdogan's AKP party faced a really energized, united opposition coalition, and they made real gains.
Substantial gains, it says here, in parliament and local elections.
Exactly. And the campaign wasn't quiet. There were mass protests demanding electoral transparency, economic reforms. The economy's been a major issue, and an end to what opponents call political repression.
Did international observers weigh in?
They did. The
Yeah.
EU, the US, they called for democratic norms to be respected, warned against government interference.
And the result? The opposition gains were enough to change the dynamic.
It seems so. Enough to force Erdogan to actually negotiate with rival parties. That's something we haven't really seen since he came to power.
So there's a possibility of actual political reform, maybe move away from that highly centralized one-man rule.
It's definitely raised that prospect, and it immediately puts Turkey's future role under the microscope, its place in NATO, its migration policies,
Yeah.
those deals with the EU on refugees, border controls, they're all up for debate now.
Okay. Wow. We've covered a huge amount of ground there, country by country. So, stepping back now, looking at all these individual stories from the material, what are the big connections? How do we sort of synthesize all this? What's the impact on alliances, the economy, social cohesion?
Well, it really reinforces that feeling of a world in flux, doesn't it?
Hmm.
You see the direct economic impact, market volatility linked to political shifts in Poland, Mexico, the UK.
Right. And trade deals being questioned in France, the UK, while Brazil's attracting new kinds of investment because of its green shift.
Exactly. Migration policies are another thread, tightening in some places, driven by nationalist campaigns, but maybe potentially shifting elsewhere, like Turkey.
And this rise of identity politics, the culture wars, seems very prominent in India, France, often targeting minorities, immigrants.
Very much so. And you see threats to established structures, the EU's cohesion, being tested by Poland and France, while Brazil tries to build this new climate bloc challenging traditional power dynamics.
And underpinning so much of it is that theme we started with, the erosion of democratic norms. We saw it clearly flagged in Indonesia, the concerns about checks and balances in Mexico.
It brings us back to that other expert quote you had from Dr. Marcus Feldman. The world is entering an era of fragmented alliances and shifting loyalties. The old rules no longer apply.
That phrase, the old rules no longer apply, that really feels like the banner headline for 2025, based on all this material, doesn't it?
I think it does. The dominant trend across most, though not all, of these shifts is this turn towards nationalist or populist rhetoric. Often it seems at the expense of that older centrist consensus.
And a key part of that seems to be voters actively turning away from traditional parties, looking for outsiders, new movements, something different.
Absolutely. Whether it promises radical change or a return to some imagined past strength.
Which almost inevitably leads to more division within societies, doesn't it? Less room for compromise. That Edelman Trust Barometer stat you mentioned earlier is chilling only 41% trust in national governments globally. Lowest ever.
It paints a pretty stark picture. But, and this is important, we also have those counterexamples from the sources. Brazil's environmental turn, South Africa's messy but ongoing coalition experiment.
Right. They show it's not all heading in one direction.
Exactly. They suggest that alternatives are possible, that democratic renewal isn't off the table even when things look tough.
So, wrapping up this deep dive then,
Right.
it feels clear 2025 wasn't just another year. It genuinely seems like a pivot point. Nationalism rising, centrism fading, new movements shaking things up. It's reshaping the whole political map.
For better or worse, depending on where you look, yes. And these shifts are likely to have really deep, long-lasting effects on alliances, economies, social harmony, even the future of democracy itself in many places.
And looking forward, the sources offer some hints about what might come next. They suggest these nationalist, populist parties might consolidate gains in upcoming elections. Germany, Canada, Australia are mentioned as ones to watch.
But on the flip side, they also suggest that a backlash against authoritarianism could fuel new pro-democracy movements, maybe like the hints we saw in Turkey. And of course, tensions in global hotspots could easily escalate as alliances shift and new leaders flex their muscles.
It brings back Dr. Mendez's words again. Expect more volatility, but also opportunities for renewal. The old rules no longer apply.
And Dr. Feldman's point too, the next decade will be defined by how societies adapt, whether through division or through innovation. It's a choice, really.
Which leads us to the final thought for you, the listener. Given all these dramatic, sometimes contradictory shifts we've unpacked today, from Poland's nationalism to Brazil's green agenda, how do you see this playing out, this tension between the search for stability and the constant push for change? What does it mean for you, navigating a world where, as these experts say, the old rules no longer apply?